Hey y'all, so this is my project 1 for my QM237 class, which is Data Analytics in Business. So for our project, we were given 3 different spreadsheets and a workbook. So we have the product details spreadsheet, the person data spreadsheet, and then this text group of details. So our first step in my project was to take the person data and turn it into a pivot table. So as you can see, I used customers to create the columns, features to create the rows, and then for the values, I did a count of features. So when I created this pivot table, I copied and pasted it into a new spreadsheet along with some of the data we were already given to create a matrix. As you can see here, this matrix I copied into other sheets which I was going to use in my clustering. So to start the data, I started by creating 2 clusters. I wanted to see, we were supposed to calculate for 2 clusters, 3 clusters, and 4 clusters, and then saw which worked the best for us. So I calculated the distance from each cluster by using the square root, the sum. So I did that for cluster 1 and cluster 2. Then I calculated the minimum distance by using the min function. I then ran solver and I used the match function which assigned each customer to either cluster 1 or cluster 2. As you can see here, Alexander was assigned to cluster 2. I also used the objective of this right here, which is the total minimum distance. So I did that for 3 different times. I did it for 3 clusters, and I did it again for 4 clusters. So next, it was time to evaluate the clusters. So first, I evaluated the 2 cluster data. So I had these different data points were grouped into cluster 1, and then these codes were grouped into the cluster 2. And as you can see, there were a lot of overlap here. I found that for cluster 1, the people in there that use that code, they seem to be younger people with likely moderate credit scores. They had a low house loan. They tend to be aged 25 to 35. They had an undergraduate degree and about 3 to 10 years of work experience. On the other hand, in cluster 2, it seemed to be for older people with likely higher credit scores. They were aged 35 to 50. Most of them had graduate degrees and over 10 years of work experience. However, you can tell these clusters weren't very accurate because the differences, they weren't super clear and there was a lot of overlap. When I evaluated it for 3 clusters, the data was much clearer. As you can see, there was little overlap for the most part. I found that cluster 1, it was older, educated people. They had more work experience, and they also had a lot of higher debt. Cluster 2, it seemed to be younger people who were less educated than cluster 1. They had less experience, but they also had very little debt. On the other hand, cluster 3, the people had some work experience, they were mostly middle-aged, had some education, and little debt. So they're kind of in between the cluster 1 and cluster 2. However, when I did cluster 4, it didn't cluster anything into the 4th cluster. And I pretty much had the same exact clusters. So that tells me that cluster 4 wasn't really needed. 3 clusters is going to be the best option for this project. Now for bonus, I went ahead and I calculated the silhouette values for each of these cluster sets. So the first thing I did was I made like a table with all the different customers, and then I calculated the Euclidean distance from each by using the square root, sum, offset, and the square root. So this helped me calculate the silhouette values. As you can see here, I've done it for the for the two clusters. So what I did was I copied the customers and along with the cluster they were in. Then I calculated the distance from cluster 1, the distance from cluster 2, and then I calculated which cluster they were the minimum distance from, which cluster were they the second minimum distance away from. So in this example, it's the farthest away because there's only two clusters. Then I calculated the cluster it was in by using the index formula. I then calculated the neighboring cluster by using the if formula. For this example, it was basically the cluster it wasn't in, like because there's only two clusters. And then I calculated the silhouette value by using the max formula. I lastly calculated the average silhouette value by taking the average of all the different silhouette values. And I got 0.46, which isn't super great, but isn't terrible either. I did this again for the 3 cluster set, and I got 0.67. It's not super accurate, but it is closer to 1 than 0. So it is a lot more accurate than 2 clusters, and it's fairly accurate since it is closer to 1 than 2. However, obviously when I tried to do this for 4, it didn't work out because I couldn't even have anything because there was 0 codes clustered into cluster 4. So yeah. So my conclusion is that for this project, 3 clusters was the best because the silhouette value was closer to 1 and 4 clusters was not accurate. It wasn't needed because nothing was clustered into that 4th cluster. So yeah, this is my project. Thank you.